part of the Earglue Media family of podcasts.
You're listening to Petticoats and Poppies.
History Girls at the Movies.
Welcome to Petticoats and Poppies, History Girls at the Movies. We're your hosts, Maggie and
Nicole. Welcome to our 7th episode where we'll be talking about the film Outlaw King. We wanted to do something a bit different to what we've covered before, and we also wanted to share a film that's easily accessible for people to watch because this one is on Netflix, and we know most of you probably have Netflix or access to a Netflix account. So we thought that we would kind of highlight this film, which I think a lot of people missed whenever it came out 2 years ago. But
despite how many people talked about it.
Exactly. Like, there was a lot of hype, I feel like, leading up to it, and then it kind of disappeared from the conversation. So I thought, it would be a really good one to visit, and I think it's a really interesting historical piece. So, yes. Maggie, do you want to tell us a bit more about the film?
So it is a historical action film about Robert the Bruce. It is set in the 14th century. It was directed by David Mackenzie. It was also written by David Mackenzie, as well as Bash Doran and James McGinnis. It stars Chris Pine, Hard Eyes, Aaron Taylor Johnson, Florence Pugh, Billy Howell. It originally premiered at the Toronto International Film Festival, and then it was edited down 23 minutes shorter before it was released on Netflix in November of 2018. And for some reason, I personally thought this came out like last year. I cannot believe it was 2018. That explains why I only made it through half of it, but I'll get to that later. I just realized, I was just like, oh, that's why I stopped.
The funny thing about this movie is that whenever it premiered at TIFF, I remember it being a big deal, partially because
such a huge deal.
and part of it was that Chris Pine does have a extremely brief full frontal nudity scene.
Yes.
And I remember people talking about that, and it's very funny now, and I almost wonder, I should have looked into it, but I'm like, was there more in like the 23 minutes that got cut out? But because I'm like, that's what everyone got so excited about. Okay.
Oh, that's a good question. I hadn't even thought to look into that.
Right? It just occurred to me. But I actually watched this movie the day it came out on Netflix.
I did too. So I started it. I think I got like halfway through it. I got to a very specific point and then I was like, I gotta stop.
I watched it with my roommate Andrew because I was like telling him like, oh yeah, there's this movie with like Chris Pine, and he was like, all right, well, like I'm just gonna like work in the kitchen, but like I don't mind if you like putting on in the living room. And then we ended up just like, he came and watched it with me, and we both liked it a lot. I think I liked this film whenever it came out more than most people did. Which, like, it's a period drama starring Chris Pine, so that's really not surprising. That caters to me pretty specifically.
Yeah.
And like that caters to both of our tastes, I think.
Indeed.
But it's really a shockingly historically accurate film. It's like, obviously there are things in it that aren't accurate. My favorite one, I was reading about, historical inaccuracy in the film, and someone pointed out that there's a scene where you can like see an artichoke. And
oh my gosh,
artichokes didn't reach Britain until the 1500s. And that might be my favorite like historical inaccuracy I've ever seen called out.
But,
I
love that that's like such a minute issue.
That is how far you have to reach.
How like historically accurate this film actually like achieved.
Right. If you have to start calling out like the foods that are on the tables, then like that you've done a good job at your historical accuracy. But yeah, I think the battle scenes are excellent. I don't think the script is anything special, to be honest, or the cinematography, but I think that there's enough good in it to more than make up for that. I think Florence Pugh is fantastic. I didn't know who she was at the time that I watched this, which is funny now because I love her. I love her work and everything that I've seen, from this way on.
You love watching her bake on Instagram.
I love to watch her like cook, bake, do anything on Instagram stories. I wish that she was in the movie, like, even a little bit more, maybe, but I think that she does a really great job with her part. She's super cute with the young girl playing
Marjorie.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I also really enjoy what Billy Howell is doing here as Edward II. Like, I think that's a really interesting performance.
Mhm.
Um,
I agree.
and not what I have come to expect from him. So I feel like he tends to play a bit more muted characters. And it almost is a little bit campy, which I love to see. So,
Yes, we do love a little bit of camp.
but yeah, in a historical villain like that, strangely enough, that is what I'm looking for.
Mhm.
But I'm really positive on the film. Like, I don't think it's a masterpiece, but I think it's a really solid movie.
Yeah, I agree. So I watched this film when it came out, like the morning of, because, everybody had been talking about it after TIFF. But I had just worked with Chris Pine like 6 months prior to this, like every day for 30 days. And so, like, I had a really hard time making it through a certain part of the film because I was just like, I have had interactions with this man. I have seen him at like 3 a.m. in the morning. Like, I have been on set with him all day. Like, it was just so weird for me to like see that scene. So it was really funny, like watching it for the podcast. Like I had forgotten, to be perfectly honest, that I had made it as far as I did in the film, and so I like turned on Netflix and it was like, "Do you want to continue watching this?" And I was like, "Wait, I actually watched like this far into the film." But it's been 2 years now, so like I was able to make it through the film this time. But what was doubly weird is that while I'm sitting here watching the film, I'm like, something about, I think it was, I can't even remember what somebody said. They mentioned a name or they mentioned a place and it like jogged something in my mind. And I was like, wait a second. So I paused the film and I pulled up Ancestry. And lo and behold, Robert de Bruce and Elizabeth de Burgh are my 23rd great grandparents. Um, Basically, their like fourth great granddaughter marries into this family that ends up moving to Massachusetts in the early 17th century. And then the line ends up fairly poor and in Tennessee. And I'm the product of that. So, I mean, how blessed am I that Chris Pine and Florence Pugh played my grandparents, great, 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 great grandparents.
That's so incredible.
It's insane. Like, I was like, Mom, you have to get back in here. This is our family. And she's super giddy because like I do Ancestry all the time and I like follow lines back and then I get lost and like move on. So I hadn't even realized it. They also mentioned my dad's side of the family when they mention Clan Fraser, which was crazy. I'm sitting there, I'm like, this is my mom's family and my dad's family interacting in the 50s. Ah, crazy. So that's my side note about my attachment to this film. But I mean, I thought it was a really good film. This is like my jam. I know Nicole is more 17th century onwards.
Yep.
But I am a sucker for medieval era films. Robin Hood is probably like my favorite legend ever. I think I can be quoted on that. Super obsessed with Robin Hood, and he's in the 1300s as well. In fact, they mentioned the Earl of Huntington, which is the same area that Robin Hood's from, so it's like all interconnected. I'm also like a huge fan of the film Tristan and Isolde, which is like mid 12th century, and it had a lot of similar vibes. Between those two films, I would see some similarities in terms of taking a more a serious approach to medieval films. So often they get kind of made into a farce. So that was nice to see. But yeah, that's my soapbox. And now Nicole's going to talk about my great 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 grandfather.
This is so fun.
It's so funny. I have like the stupidest grin right now.
I thought that I should share a bit more about Robert the Bruce in this episode because the film is actually remarkably true to his life story. Obviously, there's some condensing of timeline and whatever, but this is one of the few films that, like, at the beginning when it says, this film is based on historical events, it really truly is. Like, actually. So, there are a few small inaccuracies in the film, mostly having to do with timeline stuff. Like, they have Robert marrying Elizabeth de Burgh about 2 years after they actually were married. They show him starting the war like immediately after William Wallace's death, but he actually didn't start his campaign until about a year after William Wallace had been killed. I'm trying to think other things. Edward I actually died after the big battle of this movie, not before, and he's like interred at Westminster Abbey. And Edward II was not at the big battle, and he definitely did not fight Robert the Bruce. But honestly, I feel like that's very forgivable for the sake of a film. And
it makes the story better.
I will say, some historians would have said that the film is maybe kinder to Robert the Bruce than Truth. And
how dare you say that about my grandpappy?
Well, let's just say I think he's a little bit more Slytherin than the film shows.
Well, there you go.
They're right. I'm saying
everything.
it in a nice way, yeah. And maybe it's a little bit harsher on Edward II, who actually was known to be like quite generous to his servants and that sort of thing. But I also think it's a film about Robert the Bruce, so they're going to show him in a good light. And obviously, anything in the medieval period, whenever you are trying to adapt something, you hit up against the fact that there's not that much documentation to know what someone was actually like. But what we do know is that Robert the Bruce, or Robert I, as he's also called, was born on July 11th in 1274 at Turnberry Castle in Scotland. He was a descendant of King David I, and thus, I suppose, so is Maggie, on his father's side. And his grandfather, who was also Robert the Bruce, as was his dad, made a claim to the Scottish throne. Truly. But so, like, his grandfather makes his claim to the Scottish throne, so it's kind of sitting there. In 1298, Robert's made a Guardian of Scotland alongside John Comyn and William Lamberton, but he later resigns because he has so many issues with, is it Comyn or Common?
I think it's Common.
I think it's Common, okay. So, while his family initially supported Edward I, Robert eventually changes his allegiance over to William Wallace and this idea of an independent Scotland. Obviously, like, that's definitely partially motivated by the fact that he personally has a claim to the throne. So that probably makes him more likely to support an independent Scotland.
Yes. Wait, does that mean I have a claim to the throne? Huh.
A very distant one, probably, yes.
I have a lot of people to kill. Hang on.
Yeah. Start making your list out. It'll take you a couple of years.
There can be only one. Bonus points to anyone who gets that reference.
Oh my god. So
yes. I'm really curious to see if anyone actually like gets that reference.
Tweet us.
Yes,
if you do. So one of the things that a lot of people wanted to check the historical accuracy of is in the film, he murders Comyn in a church.
As one does.
And as he did in 1306, he does in fact murder him in the church. He doesn't finish him off. He actually goes outside and like finds his like friends and is like, yo, can you go finish that? But they kill him and the Pope excommunicates him for it. Not that he really cares, but he is crowned King of Scots later that year, on March 25th of 1306, a title that he does hold until his death in 1329. He is one of the most well-known Scottish heroes, and an interesting tidbit I actually picked up is that he is called the King of Scots and not the King of Scotland, because that title didn't actually come into use until later, which is also why we say Mary Queen of Scots and not Mary Queen of Scotland.
Interesting.
Which I thought was interesting, yeah. So, as seen in the film, the Scottish did in fact defeat the English in battle in 1307 at the Battle of, is it Loudon Hill?
It's Loudon here.
Hill?
We have a county. The county next to where I live is Loudon County.
Loudon County. Okay, perfect.
So Loudon Hill?
Loudon Hill. And they waged like a guerrilla warfare against the English. It's obviously in a lot of films about any kind of military campaign, they like to show it as like, there's a big victory and then it's one and done. But it actually goes on for many years. Robert also had to keep putting down Scottish threats to his power, other people who didn't like what he was doing or had other claims to the throne. But he does have this series of military victories between 1310 and 1314 that meant that he controlled basically all of Scotland. And at the Battle of Bannockburn? I think it would be Bannockburn.
Bannockburn?
I'm trying to think how it would sound in the accent.
Bannockburn.
Yeah.
Bannockburn. Yeah. It's harsh.
It's spelled like it sounds, so you all can look it up for yourselves now.
Yes.
But at that battle in 1314, Robert's armies defeated the much larger English armies of Edward II, which was a really significant turning point in like maintaining Scottish independence. And he even begins invading northern England and Ireland, which I find hilarious.
Power grab.
Yeah, and so in 1324, the Pope recognizes Robert I as the rightful King of Scotland, and after Edward II is actually overthrown in favor of his son, Edward III, by the English, and eventually the Treaty of, it's either called the Treaty of Northampton or some people call it the Treaty of Edinburgh Northampton. I thought since this is a movie focused on the Scots, I should use the one that includes the Scots in it.
Yes.
But the Treaty of Edinburgh Northampton is signed in 1328, and it recognizes Scottish independence, and Scotland would remain an independent country until James takes both thrones. Although it was, contested for a long time. Everybody wanted to say that they had a claim to each other's throne. Robert dies in June of 1329, and he's buried in Dunfermline Abbey.
Let's go with that.
Yeah, sure. In Scotland. So he actually, from the time he becomes king, he holds the title, although not everyone always recognizes him. But, and there's definitely ups and downs in his military campaigns. But he dies a pretty happy dude. So he's ill for a while, so not that happy. But it's not one of those stories where it's like, and then they won, and then they were killed 3 years later. So... Yeah. Overall, he did pretty well.
And I'm sure he never thought a descendant of his would be talking about a movie that was made about him.
I mean, I'm sure he would have a hard time grasping the concept of a movie. So.
Oh my gosh. It's just so crazy. Like finding that out, what was it, like 2 days ago when I texted you and was like, oh my God.
That's so weird.
Of all the movies to pick.
Truly.
And this movie had such great costumes. I know like looking at them, you would be like, oh, these are kind of simple. But really, for medieval England, the costume designer hit the nail on the head. It's very aesthetically pleasing. I watched part of the movie with my mom, who is a theatrical costumer who specializes in historical costumery. And she was thrilled to see that they leaned into the boxier shapes with the tunics that was very common in medieval England and Scotland. And, a lot of films like to make things really tight and really fit to people's bodies. And it just doesn't, it's not actually historically accurate. I mean, maybe it looks good. I don't think so. But I was really happy to see that the costume designer leaned into that. I found this really great quote from the film's director, David Mackenzie. What I told everyone is that I wanted us to make an epic, realist, anti-fantasy film. We were interested in exploring the realities of what life must have been like for our characters back then, and in doing so, trying to demythologize what we could. And I think this sentiment really played into a large part of the costume design because everything is very simple and very realistic. The costume designer was Jane Petrie, who is best known for her work in season 2 of The Crown. But she's also worked on a variety of different period pieces, either as a designer or as an assistant. She's also Scottish, and I found a few quotes where she said she felt a kinship to working on this production, since it was portraying her country's history. So with any project set in medieval period, you run into an issue that a lot of your source material comes from tapestries or etchings that don't really show detail. And sometimes you'll even get engravings, but you're not getting true colors. You're not getting, what kind of trims they had on their product or on their costumes. You're not really getting a full picture. So the costume designer utilized 20th century imagery of Laplanders who lived in Scandinavia in very remote places in yurts to kind of get this feel for what a more rustic group of people would be wearing. And these Laplanders wore oiled wool and very thick tunics because obviously it was very cold. And she wanted to see what people who were living in similar basic conditions would have been wearing. And so that's where a lot of the style kind of is borrowed from, at least in terms of materials. She also noted in an article that the chainmail that they used was ordered from a company in India that specializes in doing film production. And they did chop it all up to kind of personalize the pieces for each of the actors who are wearing it and to kind of give it a feel for this specific film. She also noted that she attempted to locate pieces in costume houses that had been used either in other productions or even on stage. But that was actually an issue. She found that a lot of the pieces looked very fantastical or were like very clearly made for the stage and kind of over dramatized. So she ended up not using anything from costume houses or pieces that had been used in previous films.
That honestly makes sense. So if you think about how long it's been since I feel like we've had a proper medieval epic movie, there were a lot of them for a period of time, but I do feel like they've kind of gone out of vogue.
Like really early 2000s, because I think what Tristan and Isolde was like 2000 and maybe 2003, and that's like the last medieval film I think I saw.
I feel like this is the first one that's come out while we were, adults. Like,
yes. And like Robin Hood, whichever one with what's his face. Wow, that was really descriptive, Maggie. Great job. The one that came out like 2 years ago, that's set in medieval England and it looks like a steampunk movie.
Right. Like
it's a serious issue. Like this leaning into fantasy, I guess that's what they think audiences want. I want realistic clothes. I know that first scene when they come outside, I was like watching all of the background performers and I was like, okay, that person has clearly been standing outside because she's got about 5 inches of wet, muddy skirt. And I'm like, that person is perfectly clean. There is not a spot of dust on them. They have been sitting and holding all day and they just got pulled into the scene. Like, it was so funny because you can see, I mean, it was clear that they were working in super brutal conditions. It was clearly cold.
Yes.
And very wet and very muddy, which is typical Scotland.
Yep.
So it's probably for the best that they utilized what Laplanders would have been wearing, these oiled wools and thick tunics. And there's also a note about the fact that Scottish soldiers wore bright yellow uniforms into battle in this period of time. And I made a note that the costume designer had gone with a more muted mustard color with the uniforms, which I thought was really nice because it reflected how dirty and grimy battle is. So,
yeah, I was reading about that and I thought that was, I read about that actually whenever I was looking at stuff about Braveheart, which we'll talk about later, but I watched that for the first time a month ago. And obviously later I will say more about how kilts. But the yellow that they used, part of why it was so popular is apparently because they would dye it just using horse urine, supposedly, and so that's why it wasn't too hard for people to get access to that color, which I thought was fascinating. We also thought, being a podcast of 2 women, that we should share some facts about Robert the Bruce's wife, Elizabeth de Burgh, who is played in the film really well, I think, by a dark-haired Florence Pugh. I realized, too, she must have been so young when she filmed this, because she's young now.
Yeah.
So, and this...
I think they filmed this in...
2017?
17? Yeah. Early 2017, I think.
Right. And she's younger than we are, I think. So, yeah, I thought that, like, it dawned on me recently that, after I had watched it, that, like, wow, she really did a good job, particularly considering her age.
Yes.
So, this is another place where, like, records on medieval women in particular are very spotty. And there's a lot unknown about Elizabeth de Burgh. What we do know is that Robert the Bruce was married before. His first wife was Isabella of Mar. Her family were close supporters of Robert's family, and Robert and Isabella were supposedly very much in love. It was a love match. They married in the early 1290s, probably. And Isabella gave birth to a daughter named Marjorie, who we see in the film, in 1296. What's interesting about Marjorie, we do see her for a bit in the film, but she ends up imprisoned in convicts for many years while her father's fighting. But she is eventually freed, and she ends up marrying this man, Walter, who is the High Steward of Scotland, and her son becomes King Robert II of Scotland, because the son of Elizabeth de Burgh, who becomes king after Robert dies childless. So the crown reverts to Marjorie's son. And it's through her that the Stuart line is born. And the Stuart line eventually becomes not just the Scottish ruling family, but also the English ruling family as well. So I thought that was very interesting. Isabella dies not long after Marjorie's birth. From what I found, it's a little bit unclear exactly when, but Robert didn't remarry for 6 years, which seems to indicate that he was actually quite upset about her death. In the time, it would have been quite common for a widower with a young child to remarry right away.
Very quickly, yeah.
Exactly. Especially if he could marry someone that would help him with a political alliance. So I think it does, the fact that he didn't remarry for so long probably does speak to the fact that they were indeed quite in love. But Elizabeth de Burgh, his second wife, was born around 1289, which, yes, does make her closer in age to her stepdaughter Marjorie than her husband. Although they don't have like a massive age gap for the period, but I did think that was interesting. That's something that I think comes through in the film quite well, is that at first, after their marriage, she almost seems more like a playmate for his daughter than an actual partner for him. Elizabeth's father, Richard Og de Burgh, was the second Earl of Ulster, and he was a very important Irish noble and a close friend of King Edward I. So they end up marrying in 1302 at Whittle in Essex, England. And when Robert is crowned King of Scots, she is crowned alongside him. And in 1306, after a military defeat, Robert sends Elizabeth and Marjorie and his two sisters to Kildrummy Castle, along with his brother Niall. And we see in the film them get captured, but actually the English conquered the castle and the women were able to slip out and go on their way. But Robert's brother Niall was indeed hung, drawn, and quartered, and we kind of see the first
so much
parts of that in the film. Luckily, we don't see the quartering.
The entrails bit was enough for me.
I was like, ooh, no thank you. Along with like all the other men in the castle. So the women do escape, but they're handed over to the English by the Earl of Ross not that long after. And Marjorie is sent to a convent, as I said before. And Elizabeth is actually held under house arrest in England for 8 years in a variety of different castles and houses, including Windsor Castle, supposedly. And she receives much better treatment than you might expect. She complains a bit that, like, you know, they don't give her any bed linens and, like, she's only has this one old woman around her. But it's because her dad is still an important noble in Edward's court, so he can't treat her too badly and piss off her dad and lose his support. Which
interesting.
I thought was interesting.
That worked out for her.
Yeah, definitely. And so in the film, we see her get trapped in this like cage on like the wall of the castle. And it seems pretty fantastical. It feels a little bit like almost like Game of Thrones-y.
It was very Game of Thrones.
So here's what's fascinating. It didn't happen to Elizabeth. It's not true. However, it does happen to Robert's sister, Mary, and this other important Scottish woman, Isabella Mcduff. Technically, Isabella Mcduff is actually in Outlaw King. We see her in the scene where, when they're crowned king and queen, and there's the woman, like, involved in the ceremony. That's Isabella Mcduff, supposedly. But they were indeed kept in these, like, wooden cages on the walls of Roxburgh and Berwick castles. And it was this like public humiliation thing and trying to make a show of them. They did both like live through it and they are eventually freed. But yeah, I thought like that's one of the things in the movie that you see it and you're like, well, that's not true. And it's not exactly true, but it is definitely based in truth.
Insane.
Yeah. Elizabeth is finally exchanged for other prisoners in 1314, and she returns to her husband in Scotland. And Elizabeth and Robert go on to have 5 children, one of whom becomes King David II of Scots. And Elizabeth dies on October 27th in 1327 in her early 40s after a horseback riding accident.
That's remarkable.
Yeah, she had a very, very fascinating life. And obviously, all of the women around Robert the Bruce end up imprisoned, basically, for a significant period of their life, especially if you think, like, she's imprisoned for 8 years and she only lives to her 40s, like her early 40s. So that's like a solid quarter of her life almost. But she made it through, and that's more than...
And manages to have 5 kids.
Yeah,
in a very short
exactly.
period of time.
Exactly. And you know, from everything that I could find, seems to have a good relationship with Marjorie, her stepdaughter. Like, I think that she's a very fascinating woman, and one of those people that I think it's a real shame that, like, we'll never really be able to know more about, because I would love to know what she was like personally.
Yes. And you touched on some of the locations that she was held. And there were a lot of locations used to make
So
The
many.
Outlaw King the film that it is. The production shot for 65 days, utilizing 45 different locations all over Scotland in order to replicate medieval Scotland and England. Matt Jones, the film's location manager, stated in a post that they chose many locations that had never had film crews there before. And though these remote places cinematically look incredible, they were often logistically challenging. I feel so bad for this poor locations manager, because just watching the film, they were either in castles, which I'm sure were very accommodating, because so many of those locations have now become like wedding locations and retreats. But some of those scenes out in the middle of nowhere, just like that is a logistic nightmare to have like company moves into remote land. Especially when you're dealing with like a large production that does utilize a lot of background actors who are dressed in chainmail and looking like ready soldiers. It's a lot.
I think what's interesting too is that in Scotland there's a lot of castles that are in ruin.
Yes.
So a lot of them you can tell they're kind of strategically placing shots so that you can't tell that, like,
you can't tell
there's no
this
roof
castle's falling apart.
Like, yeah, which obviously, like, and there are things within that sometimes might make it easier or might make it harder, but you're also like out in the Scottish weather, which is famously unpredictable.
Oh yeah, and everything I read, they talked about like it would be sunny and beautiful and it would be pouring rain within 5 minutes.
I lived in Scotland for about 5 months, and that was my experience to a T. It also hailed all the time whenever I lived there.
All the time in Scotland.
Yeah.
The one time I went to Scotland, I've been to Scotland twice. The first time we went, I was woefully unprepared. It was late July. I'd got sunburned in England.
Yep.
We went up to Scotland. I froze my butt off. I had to search everywhere to find like fleece-lined leggings so that I could wear them under my dresses, because I had only taken dresses because it was the middle of summer and it was like the heat wave. It was like the first big heat wave in London in like a decade.
Yep.
And then I go to Scotland and I just die. It rained. I was so cold. So I really pity this poor crew. Most of the original locations that, you know, were actually utilized in history are gone, like you said. You know, sometimes people like tearing down castles to make a point.
Yeah.
Throughout history. But some of the noteworthy locations include Linlithgow Palace, I think I pronounced that correctly, which is the birthplace of Mary Queen of Scots. Craigmillar Castle was also used, which was used as a safe haven by Mary Queen of Scots.
It's a really interesting castle. I've actually been to Craigmillar. I went a couple of years ago. And what's funny is I was watching the movie and I was like, hold on, I've been there. Because it's the castle that whenever they're kind of prepping to go to war, it's very distinctive because there's a tree growing in the middle of the courtyard, because they have this yew tree. And I'm like, I have a picture with that tree. And there stands Chris Pine and Florence Pugh. I love this. But it's an interesting castle because it supposedly is where Mary Queen of Scots' men planned the murder of her husband, Lord Darnley.
Oh, very nice. Yeah. And then they also used an unaltered 1500s chapel called Tullaberden Chapel.
Sure.
Yeah, we'll go with that. And then Borthwick Castle, which is a 15th century castle. They also used Dorne, which is a courtyard castle. They also use the Blackness Castle, which is another 15th century fortress. And then they also utilize the University of Glasgow and Dunfermline Abbey as Westminster and London. And the party scene where the big Black Knights party scene was used at this location as well. And it appears to have been one of their larger scenes. It was a night shoot with 150 background performers. They also had horses, swans, and dogs.
Oh my God.
So you know that poor production assistant wrangling all those creatures all night probably had the time of their life.
That's fascinating too, to think that they're filming at this abbey where Robert the Bruce was buried.
I know, right?
That's so weird. I think especially like as an American, that's very weird to me.
Yes. But you know, it's so funny, like, you know, when we started this podcast, like part of it was the fact that we like both have different perspectives on how like films are made, and like watching this one, like I couldn't not think about conditions. I've been very fortunate that I've only had to deal with extreme heat. Yeah. Which was when I was working with Chris Pine. Like 100-degree weather, full sun for 14 hours. And then like watching this and just seeing how cold and wet and miserable some of those people looked in the background. It's just like, I don't think casual viewers realize like how much like blood, sweat, and tears and freezing nights go into making the films that we watch. So
I think it's also does give it like an air of authenticity in a way. Oh yeah. Because so often you watch a movie and it's like it's meant to be summer and it's like, I can see their breath. Like it's not summer.
Films never play for the right seasons.
But this one feels right. Like it feels like you get a sense of how miserable it would be to be.
And the thing is, like, Scotland is cold and miserable regardless of what time of year it is.
Yeah. So I think, it all lent itself well. And I think that even just shooting in Scotland also, I think, gives it like an air of authenticity.
Oh, yeah.
So I think that it would be kind of impossible to talk about Outlaw King without talking about Braveheart a bit, because I think Braveheart is kind of like the medieval epic film. And obviously the two films kind of butt up right against each other, because Braveheart basically ends, with William Wallace dying, and Outlaw King picks up there, essentially. Mm-hmm. Both of them have Robert the Bruce as a character. The way that he is portrayed in Braveheart has upset some historians, and probably some Scottish people too, I would assume. Scottish people notoriously hate Braveheart. And part of that is Mel Gibson's accent, I'm sure. But both the films were filmed on location in Scotland, which I think is how like both of them have these gorgeous, gorgeous shots of scenery. But you do have a lot more, I feel like, castle shots in Outlaw King. Outlaw King basically wins over Braveheart in terms of historical accuracy, like no matter how you slice it.
Oh yeah, without a doubt.
Historians look on Outlaw King much more kindly, like, actual medieval British historians, than they do Braveheart. Particularly in terms of like characters, actual events. It showcases the battles a lot better and more realistically. Like nothing gets me in Braveheart like the fact that, there's, the Battle of Stirling Bridge, and there's no bridge in the movie. There's the whole battle is based around this bridge, and there's just not a bridge. But it's funny.
Over the hill. It's over the hill.
What's funny, Maggie, is that I actually also had found that quote from the director, David McKenzie.
I just saw this in our show notes.
About how they wanted to make an epic, realist, anti-fantasy film. Whereas I think with Braveheart, Mel Gibson is very much making a epic, fantasy, mythological film.
That was a sign of the times. I mean, that was a super popular, like, style in the 90s.
Absolutely. And it's funny though, because I did write a piece recently on kind of the legacy of Braveheart, which partially I think that film is always from here on out going to have some issues because of Mel Gibson, and because how much of it revolves around Mel Gibson, and the fact that he has shown him his true colors, let's say, and said some things that he should not. Also, historians, even whenever it came out, were pretty dismayed by it. the weaponry I thought was a very interesting thing. I read a couple of articles that kind of broke it down, and the weaponry was one of my favorite parts. The famous sword in Braveheart is definitely not realistic to what William Wallace would have used. For one thing, that thing is so big it would have been really clunky in battle. And Outlaw King isn't perfect. Actually, Robert the Bruce was known to have like a sword similar to that one, but smaller. And they don't really show it because I think they wanted to try and avoid comparisons in that way. But what someone did point out is that most swords of the time had what were called blood gutters on them, which is essentially like grooves in the metal. And most of the blades in Outlaw King, you can actually see them. There's also, towards the beginning of the film, you see a giant catapult being used. And that's one of those things that when you're watching it, kind of like the cages, you're like, well, that's probably not real. It was called the Warwolf. I could not figure out why it was called that, but the Warwolf.
Because it sounds cool.
Right? Because, like, they let a man name it. I don't know.
I was going to say, it's men. They're like, what shall we call this giant launching machine? I say the Warwolf. Well, you know what? I bet I know why. I bet when it flew through the air, it howled.
Oh, that would make sense.
Thank you. I tapped into my man brain.
Yeah. But that is a real thing that the English did have and use. Also, I think that, Maggie already talked about how good the costuming is in Outlaw King, but I'm just going to say Outlaw King does not have any kilts or face paint. So I will say
the face paint is actually accurate. That is something that the Scottish did use when they went into battle. It was used to intimidate and frighten their...
Yeah, what I read about it said that by the time of William Wallace, it had kind of fallen out of use. For the most part.
Yeah, it was more when they were fighting with, like, the Romans.
Exactly. So, like, kilts are also a thing that Scottish people do wear. They just mix two things from two very different time periods of Scottish history, and we're like, good enough. Whereas Outlaw King actually adheres much more to, like, what would Robert the Bruce have actually worn?
Tunics.
Like, what would his troops have looked like? So I think that in terms of in any terms of historical accuracy, in any terms of, like, as a historian point of view, I think Outlaw King wins.
Yes.
But I think there's an argument for, in terms of, like, as a film, which one is better.
Yeah. Braveheart definitely has really strong pacing, which I thought, I wouldn't say Outlaw King was flawed in its pacing, but there were definitely moments that are like, we could pick up on this just a little bit. And the cinematography was definitely something to be desired.
Yeah.
And I think part of Outlaw King's issue is the fact that I think it might have just been like the weather, because I mean the director of photography has worked on a lot of, really fantastic films. I mean, Barry Ackroyd, if you're listening to this, I think you cursed yourself because you were the DOP on Jason Bourne with Matt Damon. So, I mean, sorry, bud. You did it to yourself.
The Matt Damon curse.
It's the Matt Damon curse. I mean, he worked on it, I think, like 2 years before this film. So, you
That's
win
what
some,
you get.
You lose some. But, I mean, there's a couple, like, weird issues where I didn't feel like they pulled focus super well. Some interesting choices, especially when they were on the boats. Yep. I thought those were some strange choices. The cinematography is definitely better in Braveheart. And, I have, like, a super nostalgic, like, love for Braveheart. One of my cats as a child was named Braveheart. My favorite cat, yes. I claim she was named after the Care Bear, but we all know she was named after Braveheart. Because we re-rented it from Blockbuster when I was, like, 3 or 4 years old. And I remember watching it. And I've watched it a couple times since then, which is one of the reasons I was just, like, shocked and scandalized that Nicole had yet to see Braveheart. Because that's, like, even though it's not a great film, that's, like, one of those films that most people have seen a couple times because it's on TV, like, every St. Patrick's Day, because apparently they think that's the same thing as Ireland.
Oh my God. Yeah.
Every single St. Patrick's Day.
Yeah, I do think for anyone who hasn't seen it, I would recommend
watch it to be able to say that you've seen it.
I would recommend just not watching it. Your idea of what you think Braveheart is probably better than Braveheart. As someone watching it for the first time in 2020, it's
an okay film. It's a very
it's not
pretty
great
film.
It's not great.
not great. It's not, it's, yeah. I mean, watch Outlaw King and then watch Braveheart.
Yeah, that makes sense. Mel Gibson's accent and it bothers me so much. I also am at a point where I just kind of struggle to watch Mel Gibson and things.
Yeah, I hate Mel Gibson.
And I think it's one of those things where if you have, like, whenever you watch a Mel Gibson movie that you've seen before, that you grew up with, it's easier to, like, separate it. But to watch him in anything that you've not seen before, it's like, oh my God. That's the thing. I totally understand why people have nostalgia for the film, but I think seeing it for the first time in 2020 is a very different experience than people who saw it whenever it came out.
Is that? You've had so many years to watch it, Nicole.
I mean, yes, but I actually don't think I would have liked it no matter when I saw it. It is...
You probably wouldn't have. You're more refined taste than I am.
I don't want to say, like, it's a very, like, manly film. And
it is.
I don't connect well with movies most of the time that don't either have, like, a decent number of female characters, and Braveheart does not, or have some sort of, like, pretty strong, emotionally sensitive plot line between men, like something like 1917, which has, like, a very, I think, sensitive view of masculinity. I tend not to connect with films that are just, like, macho films, and I think that Braveheart is the definition of, like, macho period drama.
Oh yeah. Speaking of Mel Gibson films, have you seen The Patriot?
Yes, I grew up watching The Patriot.
Okay, I was gonna be like, girl, nostalgia.
No.
That movie right there.
Do you know baby Logan Lerman is in The Patriot, to connect us back to a prior episode?
Yes.
When I say I've watched Logan Lerman's, like, a lot of his filmography, I mean it, man.
So good.
And that's the thing, like, I can handle watching The Patriot and seeing Mel Gibson in that, but it's too jarring to see him in something that I don't have that nostalgia for. Whereas then you have Chris Pine, who is a lovely man, unproblematic.
He's so nice.
We love him. We love a man who, like, talks about how he wants to make a commitment to working with female directors.
Yes. Let me just, like, I will go on record on this podcast to say that Chris Pine is gracious. He is kind to everyone on set. He is a goofball. He pulls pranks. He shows up to set on days that he's not working just so he can hang out with Patty Jenkins. Like, seriously, he is a doll baby, and I will not take anybody saying anything against him. I won't.
So I think that if we want to, like, tally the score, I think in terms of historical accuracy, Outlaw King is the clear winner.
Yes.
In terms of as a film, I would say it's kind of, I don't know, it could go either way. It depends on maybe your personal preference. I think that Outlaw King actually does, like, maybe a better job of developing its characters, particularly its female character, than Braveheart does. But the cinematography in Braveheart's better. So, like, it's kind of I don't think either script is particularly good. Like, they're fine scripts, but neither one is, like, great. In terms of lead actor, though, I think Outlaw King's clear winner.
Oh, 100%.
110%. Yeah. So I think, you know, like you said, I think they're actually a very interesting set of films to pair together. Like, if you've not seen either of them, watch them both. And
they are a shot and a chaser.
Yeah.
And you can choose which order they go.
Yeah, definitely. But I think they'd be a fun double feature, as long as you don't mind a little bit of blood.
Yes.
Neither one of them are super gory, though. Like, it's not like some war films where, like, you're seeing guts every, like, 2 minutes.
Yeah.
But there's some disturbing scenes in both of them, I would say.
And with that, we are kind of in our closing portion of the podcast. We have been a little remiss in not going over the comments from iTunes, which this is a great reminder that if you leave us a review on iTunes or on Podchaser, if you're listening to us via Spotify or Google Play, you can find a way to review over on Podchaser. But if you review the podcast, we will read your review and thank you on the podcast. So make sure you do that. But we also got a question, actually 2 questions, which I will now read. They're both from my friend Tiernan. Her first question is more of a like request. But Nicole, I'll go with you first.
Okay.
Cast your dream historical adaptation movie.
Oh my God. Okay. So, ooh.
I'm sure you have like 52 in your head.
Yeah, I do. There's like the number one. I'm like, ooh, do I want to share that? Like, it's a movie I want to write one day. So
I know that's me. I'm like, I have a historical book I want to adapt.
I'm like,
but I'm never mentioning it.
You know what? I don't think anyone is gonna try and take this idea off of me. So I did my thesis research for my undergraduate thesis on the saloniers in Enlightenment Paris, the one who ran salons that people like Voltaire and D'Alembert and Rousseau would go and discuss their ideas in. And there's one in particular who is very near and dear to my heart. Her name is Julie de Lespinasse. I think she's fascinating. And I would love to have a movie about her. And I would want her to be played, of course, by Saoirse Ronan.
Perfect.
She has a lot of interesting relationships with older women. So I think there would be some room to like, it's funny because my cast I've had in my head for like years has been Saoirse Ronan and then Kate Winslet in another role, and they're actually about to be an Ammonite together, which is supposed to come out either later this year or next year depending on what they do with it. So someone else also likes the idea of combining them, so
they do look good together.
They do. I mean, we
like,
can reunite them in like
also,
10 years.
Kate Winslet is also wonderful to work with. Just gonna throw that out there.
I love Kate Winslet.
I worked with her last November.
All right, so Maggie, what's your movie? I'm sure you've got one ready.
I have so many. I have one that's an adaptation of a book that's from 1932 was when the book was written. But I have been good Lord, I've been adapting this book since I was like 13 years old. So that's definitely one like I will make one day. It's a weird story about a girl who falls in love with a ghost.
Without saying the name of it or anything, do you have anyone that like you definitely want to be in it if you did get it made?
Honestly, the girl, if I could get it made this year, because the girl is young, she's like 18. Florence Pugh would be perfect as her because she's got this like perfect guileless like innocence about her, but also like very determined and very headstrong. Which is like this great duality of that character. As far as the ghost, I have seen so many different people over the years in my head for who that character would be played by. And gosh, I can't think of anybody currently. But he's a soldier in World War One. So somebody that kind of fits that like World War One soldier look.
Aesthetic,
Yeah, it's a very specific aesthetic. I even have like the location and everything plotted out in my head. But
oh my God.
For like an easier answer to this question, I would love to see an updated William Wallace film with Sam Heughan playing William Wallace. I love Sam Heughan. He plays another one of my ancestors over on Outlander. And I just think he's perfect. I've been a huge fan of Sam Heughan since he was in a really corny Christmas movie where I think he plays the prince. It's one of those like I Married a Prince Hallmark movies with Katie McGrath. Katie McGrath.
Oh my God.
From Merlin plays the love interest, and they're both like they're babies. You would not even recognize him. He is not the hunky Outlander we all know and love. But yeah, I would love to see him, and I think he would absolutely kill that role.
I also feel like we kind of deserve another William Wallace film
with an actual Scotsman.
Well,
I mean,
also,
no offense to Chris Pine, but he is American.
Well, but also just like someone who can actually do the Scottish accent.
Yeah, just like casual, just like cast a Scotsman, please.
Yeah, I think that would be really cool, and then I think also like I would be able to rest easier with Braveheart out there in the world if there was another good movie that actually
and you know what? That movie would be a blockbuster.
Oh, it would.
Sam Heughan has so many fans.
They're intense too.
they're
I respect
I have some
them.
words about them.
Yeah.
Mad respect. I sat through the New York Comic-Con panel for Outlander last year.
Okay.
And I thought I was gonna get murdered because I was in the front row because I'd been there all day.
Yeah.
And those women were going to murder me.
They're intense.
If I moved an inch, like 5 people would start running. I was like, dude,
Oh my
no,
God.
I'm not getting up.
You're like, I'm not leaving.
But yeah, that's that's my experience. And then Tiernan also asked what our historical movie pet peeves are.
Ooh.
And
mine is the presence of Matt Damon in a historical film.
frankly.
Actually, though, and this is going to sound quite weird, I know, but there are some actors who, no matter how good of an actor they are, look modern. Like Emma Stone, I look at her face and I know that she has used a microwave. You know, like you can put her in whatever outfit you want to, and I know that she knows what the internet is. And sometimes there are actors who just really take me out of historical films like that. And it's not that it's their fault. Like, I'm trying to think if I have other historical movie pet peeves. One of mine is like bad or half-hearted accents.
Can't stand them.
Particularly because so often the accent that they're trying to put on is not the actual accent the person would have had anyways, because like accents have changed over time. So it's kind of like, well, if you can't do it, why are they even having you try? Because now it's just distracting. I'm trying to think, do I have other?
One of my biggest pet peeves is hair. Women did not wear their hair down, and so many films are like, we're just gonna make her have this like beachy wave look, and I'm like,
And occasionally,
I mean, is she one of those kind of women? Because women did not wear their hair down.
Occasionally, I'm okay with it. In something like Little Women, I actually think it works well because it's based on the Alcott family, who were kind of like the hippies of their day.
Oh yeah, no, that suited that was like one of the few times that I was like, this works.
But unless you're trying to like make a character statement with having her hair down, her hair needs to be up. Like.
And sometimes it looks like they forgot to send her to hair and makeup before she came to set. Like,
that's another one of mine, I guess, is like very modern looking makeup in historical films. When I'm like, is she wearing eyeliner?
Honestly, I would love to see a historical film where the actress has like acne.
Oh my God,
because it was an issue, and like they had pox marks, and they like. I've always said that like I have acne scars, and I've always said this must be to some extent what like having pox marks felt like, because you want to cover them up. But I would love to see like actors actually embracing those flaws in their skin when they're playing these very like deeply historical films, because they wouldn't have been wearing makeup.
That's one of the things that I really like about the film Mary Queen of Scots, is that they acknowledge that like the reason that Queen Elizabeth I went so intense with her makeup was because she was covering up pox scars, because she had the pox. And I love that they actually address that. And even in the makeup, you can tell that they're trying to make it look like her skin is flawed beneath it.
Yes.
And I don't think we see that enough. That sort of more naturalistic look. I feel like I definitely have other ones. Every so often, I know one. Calling cities by the wrong name.
Oh God, yes.
Like, particularly, I feel like it's very relevant with Russian cities. But, you know, whenever they'll say like, oh, well, in St. Petersburg, and it's like, well, it wasn't called that then. Like, that's Stalingrad, but, you know, things like that. Which is, again, that's like such a like pretentious historian thing to say. But I remember being like a little girl and watching the animated Anastasia film and being like, wait, when it was communist, it wasn't called St. Petersburg anymore. Like 7-year-old me. It's like, excuse me?
They also do that a lot with like Roman history.
Yes.
And into the Holy Wars, they get that wrong a lot. Because I mean, a lot of things got moved around. I mean, like I've seen a film that called Constantinople. Oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the name it was before. Of course, like
What
why did we
was
say it?
Byzantium? No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
That feels right to me. This is before my time period.
This is my time period, but it is almost midnight. And my brain is like,
if I was right, then I truly called that from my like 9th grade world history class.
Yeah, you pulled it. Alternative name.
Oh my God.
But yeah, I've seen films that they referred to it as a name that it most definitely was. Oh wait, no, Istanbul.
Istanbul. Yeah.
Istanbul. But it was called Byzantion in Greek.
Yeah.
Interesting. Anyways, I watched a film when it should have been called Constantinople, and they referred to it as Istanbul twice. And I was like, and that was on the History Channel. So
Yeah.
just saying. But I mean, there's a lot of, I definitely think I have like a long list of like a CVS list of pet peeves in historical films. And most of it is, comes down to the fact that they don't have like actual historians on set.
Yeah. Oh, I know my big one.
Consult with them.
My big one is definitely, and this is like less a pet peeve and more like an actual like issue, but the undermining of female or other minority figures.
Yes.
Portraying them as dumb or vain or
Sidekicks.
shallow or yeah.
I'll still never forgive the Great Wall for
Yep. This is an issue I have with the
relegating
Great
an
Wall.
amazing actor to the sidekick role.
And also along with that, like I think anytime you have someone who was, famously and is known to have been gay, and that's treated either as a bad trait or kind of pushed to the side, or like you know what I mean. I'm talking about The Imitation Game right now, or like Bohemian Rhapsody.
Yeah. I mean, I would even argue that some elements of The Favorite kind of makes fun of them. Yeah. I mean, this is an anti-favorite podcast. Like, I'm sorry.
We are
if
anti
like
The Favorite. If you'd like to watch a movie from that year about queens, you can watch Mary Queen of Scots.
Yeah, honestly, I had those two screeners that year. That was my first year voting in the SAG-AFTRA, and I was just like, wow, these are night and day.
Yes.
I voted for Mary Queen of Scots, so.
And I'm still grateful to you.
Because I just, I mean, if you like The Favorite, and I know, like, it has a merit to the fact that people who are not period drama lovers watched The Favorite and loved it. So, I mean, more power to you. It made people want to go read about that period of history. And I'm always for, like, there are some very, very popular historically based products out there right now that are not my cup of tea. But I know people who never liked history who have picked up books about these historical figures and learned things. So I'm always going to be like grateful for that. But yeah, no. The Favorite.
Yeah. If you're listening and you would like us to do a full episode on The Favorite, like, do let us know, because it's the kind of thing where I don't think we're going to do it unless we actually get asked to do it, because I don't like, a lot of people like that film. I'm happy for them. I don't think it's a period drama made for people who like period dramas.
Here's what I propose. We will do The Favorite when we get to, like, what are we at? Like 200, almost 200 followers on, like, let's say 250. If we get to 250, we'll do a podcast on it, and maybe we'll do like a live stream, like come hang out with us and we'll talk about it, and then like actually record a full episode. Like, we'll do something like that. So that we can just trash it. We'll like have a glass of wine and trash The Favorite.
I mean, that's my hobby.
Honestly.
So I know that we have some reviews to share on a nicer note.
Yes, some lovely reviews from some lovely people.
Yeah. Do you wanna read the first one, Maggie?
Do you want to do the first two, and then I'll do the one from the one that I actually personally know?
Perfect. That's perfect. Okay. So I'll go ahead and read the first one. It's from, oh gosh, I don't want to like mispronounce this name, but Haida, is that right? Hopefully that's right. I'm so sorry if not. And they said, feeds my nerdy soul. This podcast hits on so many things I love, classic literature and period pieces in general. I'm a huge nerd for all these things, and it feeds my soul. Thank you, ladies, for this incredible podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Love to find a kindred spirit.
Yes.
That's very much what we are all about.
And then my friend Diana reviewed us, and she said, great listen. I love learning little tidbits and facts about films. Bundle that with historical periods, and you've got a fun, interesting, and educational podcast that everyone can learn from. Give it a listen. So I appreciate that.
So nice. Thank you. And then we also have one from Top Rope Review that says, awesome show. I'm a big history nerd and I love movies, so checking this podcast out was a no-brainer. It's a fun show and the hosts really know their stuff. A definite must listen. That makes me so happy to hear people say that they think that we know our stuff.
Seriously.
I'm always a little bit nervous that like I've not done enough research, even though I'll spend like hours researching. But obviously the thing is, we are not experts in all of the periods that we talk about because there's no way that we could be. And so, you know, like
we try.
The medieval period is not my thing, but I try my best. So it's really great to hear that it's coming off well.
Yes. I actually had a nightmare last night that I was unable to talk about medieval England. So
oh my God.
we definitely like worry about presenting these films and the history like to the fullest extent that we can. Which actually brings me to an update on the Great Wall episode. My friend Becca speaks Mandarin, and she reached out and let me know after listening to our podcast that the Rest in Peace translation that we discussed in the episode was actually a bad translation from what they were actually saying to the English subtitles. So what they actually said was, please, Palace Hall Commander, be relieved. I'm not going to attempt to say it in Mandarin, but basically, to some extent, it's like no resting, no peace. That was what they were actually saying. They were not saying rest in peace, just whoever translated it, you know, kind of took some liberties with it, which is great to know.
Yeah, that's very nice. And I love that someone actually reached out and told
Seriously,
us
I love that. I was so happy because like, I don't speak Mandarin.
So thank you so much, Becca, for letting us know what happened there and that it was the translation's fault and not the actual script, which is a relief.
It gives it a very small, like a corner of a star.
Yeah, it's still my least favorite film I've ever seen. So
yeah, freaking Matt Damon.
Oh, Matt Damon. I don't know why this has become like such a shtick, but it's here now, folks. Get used to it.
That's two films in a row that somebody who worked on Jason Bourne also worked on the film.
Oh God. Oh man.
It's the Matt Damon connection.
We only do films that are somehow connected to Matt Damon.
Honestly, can we blame Matt Damon for the Artichoke?
Yeah, Matt Damon is the Artichoke. This is why you shouldn't record late at night, folks. All right. Are we good to... do you have any final thoughts that you want to share before we wrap up?
Chris Pine is the best Chris.
I don't agree completely with you, but he is my second favorite Chris, so...
Yes, we all know where your heart lies.
We all know who holds
and it's not
my
Chris
whole heart.
Pratt.
No. Wow, I need to stop like saying things against popular Hollywood actors on this podcast. People are probably
honey,
does she have a problem?
People rightfully have issues with Chris Pratt. It's all good.
I mean,
he's no Andy Dwyer.
Well, on that lovely note.
On that note,
everyone stan Chris Pine to, water your crops and clear your skin. Yep. Thank you so much for listening to our 7th episode of Petticoats and Poppies History Girls at the Movies.
We'd love to hear from you on social media and to hear what you thought of The Outlaw King. We'd also love for you to send us any other films that you would love for us to review.
You can find us on social media at HGATM Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can find Maggie at Maggie of the Town and me at Nicole Ackman 16.
You can listen to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or on the Earglue Media website. If you like what you hear, don't forget to leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts or on Podchaser. Every other episode, we will be trying to read our Apple Podcast reviews, so be sure to leave us one there if you would like to be featured like those that were featured today.
We'll be back soon with another exciting episode as we continue to look at period films from a history and film perspective. I look forward to the day that I no longer have to say this, but stay safe, wear a mask, stay healthy, and we'll see you guys next time.
Bye. You've been listening to Petticoats and Poppies.
History Girls at the Movies.
And I was like,